"There's no way that dog should be in here," Nurse Carol practically shouted as she clutched the security footage printout in her hands. Her blue eyes darted between the paper and the hospital director, Dr. James Howell, whose face had turned an odd shade of pale. But there he is. The hospital security office was crammed with staff who had gathered after the overnight nurse reported something unusual. Carol's voice had an edge of disbelief as she pointed at the grainy image on the screen. The dog, large, shaggy, and golden brown, was curled up beside a frail, elderly man in one of the hospital beds. His tail rested lightly on the patient's arm, as if he was keeping watch. "That's Henry Jensen's room," Dr. Howell murmured, rubbing his temples. "He's been here for months now. No visitors, no family, just him. And a dog, apparently," said one of the younger nurses, Rachel, her eyebrows high. "A dog who has somehow figured out how to sneak into a hospital with a full security system." The overnight guard, Greg, crossed his arms. "I double-checked the footage. The dog comes in right around midnight and leaves before sunrise, every night. We checked the logs. No one's letting him in. No alarms, no unlocked doors." Carol looked at him skeptically. "Dogs don't just walk through locked doors, Greg. How is he getting in?" "That's what I'm saying," Greg replied. "I don't know, but he does." Rachel exhaled through her nose, shifting her weight. "Is it possible someone brings him in? A patient's family member, maybe?" Greg shook his head. "We checked. The dog's alone every time." A murmur spread through the room. The hospital was a small one, located in the quiet outskirts of town. Strange things didn't happen here, not usually. This, however, was beyond strange. Dr. Howell sighed. "Fine. Set up a camera in Mr. Jensen's room tonight. We need to know how this dog is getting in." That night, as the hospital quieted, the camera recorded. The halls were still, save for the occasional nurse checking on patients. The machine hum of ventilators and beeping monitors filled the air in the rooms where people slept through their healing. The staff waited, watching the monitor in the security office with an intensity usually reserved for major emergencies. Then, just past midnight, movement. "There!" Rachel nearly jumped from her seat. The camera focused on the hospital hallway, just outside room 214, Henry Jensen's room. At first, nothing seemed out of place. Then, a shadow moved near the door. The dog appeared, walking with quiet purpose, his golden brown fur illuminated by the hallway's dim emergency lighting. But there was no one else. No doors opening. No gaps in the security. The dog simply appeared. The hospital staff stared at the screen in stunned silence as the dog trotted inside and gently nudged the door open just enough to slip through. The door had been closed. Not locked, but not open either. He had nudged it with practiced ease, stepping inside as though he belonged there. Inside the room, Henry Jensen lay asleep, his breaths shallow and slow. The dog jumped up onto the bed, careful, almost reverent in the way he moved. He circled once before laying down beside the old man, resting his head on Henry's arm. The man didn't wake, but his breathing steadied. A warmth spread through the security office as the staff watched the scene unfold on the monitor. A dog that shouldn't have been there, in a place where he didn't belong, offering quiet comfort to a man who had no one else. "Who is he?" Carol whispered. "Better question is, where does he go when he leaves?" Greg muttered. "And how does he get in at all?" The next morning, Dr. Howell made a decision. "We need to follow him." And so, when the clock crept past midnight the following night, a few select staff members gathered, waiting. The dog did not disappoint. Right on time, he padded through the hallway, slipping into Henry Jensen's room with the same quiet devotion as before. But this time, the staff was ready. Greg and Rachel waited outside the door, prepared to follow the dog once he left. But what they saw inside made them freeze. Henry Jensen, who had not spoken in weeks, was awake. He had one frail hand resting on the dog's back, stroking gently, as he whispered something neither Greg nor Rachel could hear. His face was peaceful, his expression filled with something that looked a lot like happiness. Rachel let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "We can't stop this." Greg nodded, lowering the walkie-talkie in his hand. "No, we can't." Instead, they stepped away, waiting until morning, when the dog left just as quietly as he arrived. Dr. Howell met them at the nurses' station. "Well?" Rachel spoke first. "Sir, I think the dog should stay." Dr. Howell frowned. "He's not a therapy dog. He's not even a registered service animal. He's helping," Greg interrupted. "That's enough." The doctor exhaled, rubbing his chin. He had seen it himself. The way Henry Jensen had looked, the way his breathing had evened out, the way something in him had stirred back to life at the presence of that dog. He had spent enough years in this hospital to know when something mattered, even when it defied logic. "All right," he said finally. "We keep watching. If this dog is bringing someone peace, then maybe that's what matters." That night, the dog returned once more. The staff watched, some curious, some moved, some simply unable to look away from something so simple, yet so profound. And Henry Jensen, once again, slept soundly with his silent guardian by his side. What they didn't know, what they couldn't know yet, was that Henry Jensen wasn't the only one the dog had come for, and that this was only the beginning. Carol tapped her pen against the clipboard, staring down at the notes she had taken throughout the day. The staff had spent every shift watching for signs of the dog, their curiosity turning into something bordering on reverence. No one could quite explain how he got in or why he had chosen Henry Jensen's room, but no one wanted to stop him either. Every nurse, every doctor, even the janitors had their theories. Some whispered about guardian angels, others about lost pets looking for a home. But whatever the reason, they all knew something special was happening. Rachel, standing beside Carol at the nurses' station, exhaled sharply. "You know, I heard Mr. Jensen talk again today. He said the dog reminds him of someone. He wouldn't say who, though." Carol's brows furrowed. "Someone? Like a person?" Rachel shrugged. "I don't know. He just had this far-off look in his eyes. He called the dog Buddy. I think that's what he named him." "Buddy?" Carol murmured, rolling the name around in her mind. It suited him. At exactly midnight, Buddy appeared again. The security footage confirmed it, but no one needed to watch the cameras anymore. They could feel when he arrived, a sort of quiet shift in the air. He padded down the hall, slipping into Henry Jensen's room, curling up in his usual spot by the old man's side. And like always, Henry relaxed. But tonight, something was different. Carol and Greg had stationed themselves near the hallway, determined to see where Buddy went when he left. They waited, listening to the hush of the hospital at night. Machines beeped, footsteps echoed, and somewhere down the corridor, a patient coughed softly in their sleep. Time stretched on until, finally, just before dawn, Buddy stirred. Greg nudged Carol. "He's moving." They followed him as silently as they could, their shoes making the barest squeaks against the tile floor. Buddy moved with a quiet confidence, like he belonged here, like he had done this 100 times before. He walked past the nurse's station, down the hall, and then… "He's heading toward the east exit," Carol whispered. Greg frowned. "That door's always locked. He won't get out." But then, right as Buddy reached the door, something happened. The latch clicked open. The door swung slightly ajar, just enough for him to slip through before it shut again, leaving the two nurses frozen in place. Carol's heart pounded. "Did you see that?" "I saw it," Greg said, his voice low. "But I don't understand it." They raced to the door, yanking it open and stepping outside into the chilly night air. The parking lot stretched out before them, dark and empty save for a few dimly lit streetlights. But Buddy was already gone, vanished into the night as if he had never been there. Greg ran a hand through his hair. "This doesn't make any sense." Carol took a steadying breath. "We'll figure it out. We have to." The next day, Henry Jensen was stronger than he had been in weeks. His cheeks had a bit more color, his voice a bit more strength. He spoke more, though still not often, but enough for the nurses to notice. And every time Buddy came, Henry smiled. It was the kind of smile that reached down into the soul and warmed everything it touched. Rachel sat beside Henry's bed that afternoon, casually chatting while checking his vitals. "You know, Mr. Jensen, that dog of yours is quite the mystery. He shows up out of nowhere. No one knows where he comes from, and no one knows how he gets in." Henry gave her a tired but knowing look. "You don't need to know where he comes from, dear. You just need to let him be here." Rachel tilted her head. "You really believe that, don't you?" He nodded. "We don't always get to know why good things happen. Sometimes we just need to be grateful that they do." That night, Carol and Greg came prepared. Instead of waiting by the door, they placed a small GPS tracker inside a loose loop on Buddy's collar. They had no idea if it would work, no idea if they'd get any answers at all, but they had to try. When dawn came and Buddy disappeared once more, Carol raced back to her phone, pulling up the tracking app. A blinking dot appeared on the screen. It was moving, fast, heading straight out of town. She grabbed Greg's arm. "We have to follow him." They jumped into Carol's car, the GPS dot leading them farther than they had expected. The town disappeared behind them, replaced by open roads, sparse trees, and eventually a small, run-down house at the very edge of the countryside. The dog's signal was right there. Carol and Greg exchanged glances before stepping out of the car. The house looked abandoned, paint peeling, windows cracked, the porch sagging under years of neglect. But the front door was slightly ajar. Greg hesitated. "Are we really doing this?" Carol nodded. "We need to know." They stepped inside. The house was quiet, dust motes swirling in the dim morning light filtering through the windows. In the center of the living room sat an old, worn dog bed, a water bowl nearby, long dried out. On the wall, framed pictures hung crookedly. Carol stepped closer, eyes scanning the photographs, and then she saw it. "Greg," she whispered. "Look." In the pictures, a younger Henry Jensen stood beside a golden-brown dog. The same dog. Buddy. Greg's breath hitched. "That's impossible." Carol reached out, brushing dust off one of the frames. The date printed at the bottom was from nearly 15 years ago. "This dog shouldn't be here," Greg murmured. "He should be. Gone," Carol finished for him. "But he's not. He came back." A shiver ran down her spine, but not from fear. Something about this was beautiful. Something about this was right. They left the house in silence, the weight of what they had just seen pressing down on them. When they returned to the hospital, Henry was awake, a smile touching his lips. His hand rested on Buddy's back as the dog curled up beside him, and in that moment neither of them looked like they had a care in the world. Carol didn't say anything about what they had found. Neither did Greg. Some things didn't need to be explained. Some things were better left as they were. But as she watched Buddy settle in beside Henry, something in her knew. This wasn't just a visit. It was a promise, and it wasn't over yet. Henry Jensen's improvement did not go unnoticed. The man who had spent months lying motionless in bed, barely speaking, now had life in his eyes. He still wasn't strong enough to move around much, but there was a quiet determination in him that hadn't been there before. And everyone knew why. Buddy continued his nightly visits, arriving like clockwork and curling up beside Henry. Every morning, he would disappear just before sunrise, slipping away through the same mysterious means. No one tried to stop him anymore. They had all accepted that he belonged here, even if they didn't understand how or why. Rachel sat with Henry one afternoon, watching as he absently stroked Buddy's fur. "He's helping you, isn't he?" she asked softly. Henry nodded. "More than you know." His voice was still rough from lack of use, but there was a strength in it now. "I thought I'd never see him again." Rachel hesitated. "Henry, how do you know him?" The old man sighed, leaning back against his pillows. "Buddy was my dog a long time ago. My wife and I adopted him when he was just a pup. He was the best dog I ever had. Always knew when I needed him, always by my side." His gaze drifted toward the window, his thoughts far away. He passed 15 years ago. Rachel's heart clenched. "Then, how is he here?" Henry didn't answer right away. He scratched behind Buddy's ears, the dog leaning into his touch. "Maybe some bonds don't break. Maybe some love is too strong to fade." Rachel wanted to believe that, but the logical part of her mind rebelled. Dogs didn't come back, not like this. But she had seen the photos in Henry's old house, the undeniable proof that Buddy had once belonged to him. Yet here he was, as real as the chair she was sitting in. Carol and Greg had decided to keep their discovery to themselves. There was something sacred about it, something that didn't need explanations. They had stopped tracking Buddy's movements, stopped trying to figure out how he got in. All that mattered was that he was here. One night, however, things took a turn. It started with a phone call. Carol had just settled into the nurse's station when the emergency line rang. "Nurse Carol speaking," she answered automatically. "We need assistance in room 214, came the urgent voice of Dr. Howell. "Mr. Jensen is unresponsive." Carol's heart dropped. She was out of her chair before she had even hung up, rushing down the hall with Rachel and Greg on her heels. They burst into the room to find Henry lying still in his bed, his face pale, his breathing shallow. Buddy was curled up against his side, unmoving, as if he could sense what was happening. Dr. Howell was already checking Henry's vitals. "His pulse is weak. We need to move fast." The next few minutes were a blur of activity. The crash cart was brought in, monitors beeped wildly, and the hospital staff worked with practiced efficiency. But as they fought to stabilize him, Buddy did something that made everyone freeze. The dog let out a low, mournful whine. Then he stood up, stepping carefully over Henry's arm. His brown eyes locked onto Henry's face, and he let out a single, soft bark before laying his head down on Henry's chest. A moment later, Henry took a deep breath. The monitors steadied. His heartbeat, which had been fluttering dangerously, evened out. His breathing grew stronger. Slowly, his eyes flickered open. The room was silent, every doctor and nurse staring in shock. Henry blinked up at the ceiling, then turned his head slightly to look at Buddy. A small, knowing smile touched his lips. "You're still here," he whispered. Dr. Howell, Always the rational man cleared his throat. "We should keep monitoring him closely. This could have been a coincidence, but—" "It wasn't," Carol interrupted, her voice firm. "We all saw it." Dr. Howell didn't argue. He simply nodded, his eyes lingering on Buddy a moment longer before turning back to his patient. "For now, let's just be grateful he pulled through." Henry was kept under close watch for the next 24 hours, but he showed no signs of another crisis. In fact, he seemed stronger than before. And Buddy remained by his side, rarely leaving except for the brief moments he disappeared before dawn. But something about the incident had shaken Carol. That night, long after her shift had ended, she found herself sitting in the hospital garden, staring up at the sky. The stars twinkled above, indifferent to the mysteries playing out below them. Greg found her there a while later, hands in his pockets. "Couldn't sleep either?" Carol shook her head. "I can't stop thinking about it. Henry should have crashed. He should have—" "Died?" Greg finished for her. Carol sighed. "Yeah, but he didn't. Buddy was there, and somehow he saved him." Greg sat beside her on the bench. "You know what I think?" "What?" "I think we don't always get the answers we want. Sometimes things happen that we're not meant to understand." He leaned back, staring up at the sky. "And maybe that's okay." Carol wanted to argue, to say that there had to be a reason for all of this. But as she looked up at the endless stretch of night above her, she wondered if Greg was right. Maybe some mysteries weren't meant to be solved. Maybe some were just meant to be felt. Inside the hospital, Buddy lay curled up beside Henry, his steady breathing matching the old man's own. And as the first rays of dawn began to creep through the window, Henry reached down, resting a hand on the dog's head. "I'm not ready to go yet, Buddy," he murmured. "Not just yet." And Buddy, as if he understood every word, gave a small wag of his tail and stayed right where he was. The hospital settled into its usual rhythm, but there was an unspoken awareness among the staff that something extraordinary was happening in room 214. Everyone was careful not to say too much about it, almost as if speaking it aloud might break whatever delicate magic existed between Henry Jensen and Buddy. Rachel had never considered herself a superstitious person, but she found herself lingering near Henry's room more often than before, watching the way Buddy curled up next to him every night without fail. She wasn't the only one. Carol and Greg had given up trying to solve the mystery of how Buddy arrived and left. It no longer mattered. What mattered was that Henry was improving. Slowly, yes, but unmistakably. His color was better. His voice grew stronger. He was eating more, and for the first time in months he even asked to sit up in bed. That night, as Carol finished checking on patients, she glanced at the security monitor near the nurse's station. As expected, Buddy was already in Henry's room, curled up in his usual spot. But this time, Henry wasn't asleep. He was sitting up, speaking softly, his frail hand running through Buddy's thick fur. She didn't know what he was saying, but the sight of it made something catch in her throat. It was easy to forget that, before Buddy, Henry had spent months lying in silence, his body weak and his spirit fading. Rachel approached from behind. "You see it too?" Carol nodded, unable to look away from the screen. "I don't think we'll ever understand what's happening." Rachel smiled faintly. "Maybe we're not supposed to." The night continued without incident, but something was different. Carol sensed it the moment she stepped into the hallway early the next morning. It wasn't anything tangible, but the air itself felt heavier, as though something had shifted overnight. She made her rounds quickly, heart pounding as she approached room 214. The door was slightly ajar, just as it always was when Buddy left before dawn. Carol stepped inside, expecting to find Henry asleep with Buddy gone for the day. But Henry was awake, and so was Buddy. He was still there, still curled up beside Henry, but his body was tense, his ears perked. His brown eyes, usually calm and warm, were now alert, staring at something unseen. Henry's frail fingers were buried in the thick fur at Buddy's neck, his grip weak but steady. Carol frowned. "Mr. Jensen?" Henry's gaze met hers, and something in his expression made her chest tighten. It wasn't fear exactly, more like awareness. "He's waiting," Henry said softly. "Something's coming." A chill ran down Carol's spine. "What do you mean?" Henry didn't answer. He just looked down at Buddy, his hand still resting on the dog's back. Carol stepped closer, trying to make sense of what she was feeling. And then, the machines beeped. A rapid, frantic rhythm filled the room as Henry's heart rate spiked. Carol sprang into action, pressing the call button. Rachel and Greg rushed in within seconds, followed closely by Dr. Howell. The room became a blur of movement, orders being called, hands working quickly, but through it all, Buddy didn't move. He stayed right where he was, his large body pressed against Henry's side, his presence an anchor in the storm. Minutes passed, each one stretched thin by urgency and fear. Then, as suddenly as it began, the crisis passed. Henry's heart rate slowed, his breathing steadied. The machines calmed. Dr. Howell exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "That was close." Rachel nodded, her hands shaking slightly as she adjusted Henry's IV. "Too close." Carol stepped back, eyes flickering to Buddy. He was still watching Henry, his body still, his breathing even. But there was something in his eyes, something deep, something knowing. Dr. Howell checked Henry's vitals again before finally speaking. "He needs rest. We'll keep monitoring him." As the team left the room, Carol lingered for a moment longer. Henry's eyes were closed now, his breathing slow but even. Buddy remained at his side, his head resting gently against Henry's arm. "You knew, didn't you?" she whispered, more to herself than to the dog. "You knew it was coming." Buddy didn't respond, of course, but something in the way he settled just a little closer to Henry made her feel like he had heard her. The following days passed in a strange, fragile kind of peace. Henry remained stable, though he was weaker than before. Buddy never left his side, even during the day. The staff had long stopped questioning his presence. Instead, they adjusted to it, working around the dog as if he were just another part of the hospital routine. It was Greg who finally put words to what they had all been thinking. One evening, as he and Carol stood by the nurse's station, watching Henry's room from a distance, he murmured, "He's not just here to help Henry get better, is he?" Carol swallowed hard. "No, he's not." Greg nodded slowly, as if he had already known the answer before he asked the question. "He's here to stay with him. Until the end." Carol looked away, blinking back an unexpected sting in her eyes. "Yeah, I think he is." Neither of them spoke after that. They didn't need to. The truth was there, unspoken, as steady and sure as the heartbeat on Henry's monitor. That night, when Carol checked the security footage again, she saw something that sent a fresh wave of emotion crashing over her. Buddy was still in Henry's room, as always, but for the first time since they had started watching, Henry had fallen asleep with a smile on his face. Carol shut off the monitor and sat back in her chair. She didn't need to watch anymore. She didn't need to know how Buddy got in or how he would eventually leave. Some things weren't meant to be understood. Some things just were. And in that moment, she knew, whatever came next, Buddy wouldn't let Henry face it alone. The hospital moved forward as it always did, with patients coming and going, staff keeping up with their rounds, and the rhythm of beeping monitors filling the halls. But for those who paid attention, there was something different about room 214, something unspoken, yet undeniable. Henry Jensen was still here, and so was Buddy, and in some quiet, unexplainable way, that mattered. Rachel had taken to sitting with Henry more often. She told herself it was just part of her duties, making sure he was comfortable. But she knew there was more to it than that. She wanted to understand. She wanted to be there for whatever was happening, even if she couldn't explain it. One evening, as she adjusted Henry's blankets, she finally asked the question that had been weighing on her. "Henry, do you remember when you first saw Buddy again? When he showed up here?" Henry's tired eyes flickered open. He took a slow breath before nodding. "I do." Rachel sat down beside him. "What did it feel like?" A small smile played on Henry's lips. "Like something I had been waiting for without knowing it. Like coming home." Rachel swallowed. "You said you lost him years ago, but you don't seem surprised that he's here now." Henry ran his fingers through Buddy's fur, his movements slow but full of affection. "Rachel, there are things in this world we can't explain. Doesn't mean they aren't real. Doesn't mean they aren't meant to be." She wanted to believe that. But logic, science, and reason all told her otherwise. Dogs didn't just come back. Not like this. And yet, she had seen it with her own eyes. As the night stretched on, Henry grew tired, his words becoming softer, his breathing slower. Rachel sat with him a little longer before stepping outside the room. Carol was waiting by the nurse's station, arms crossed. "How is he?" Carol asked. Rachel sighed. "Tired, but peaceful. He believes Buddy is here for a reason." Carol nodded, as if she had expected that answer. "I think we all do." Greg approached, setting down his clipboard. "You know, I checked again. No record of Buddy. No one ever sees him come in. And the door logs still don't explain how he leaves." Rachel wasn't surprised. "Maybe we should stop trying to explain it." Greg smirked. "That doesn't sound like you." She laughed softly, shaking her head. "Yeah, well, I guess some things change." That night, Carol, Rachel, and Greg lingered near room 214, keeping their distance but unable to look away. Buddy stayed curled up beside Henry, just as he always did. And Henry, for the first time in a long time, looked content. The next morning, Henry woke up stronger than anyone had expected. He sat up without being prompted. He ate a full breakfast. He even cracked a joke to one of the younger nurses who had come in to check his vitals. It was as if, against all odds, something in him had started to heal. Dr. Howell reviewed Henry's charts, his brow furrowed in disbelief. "This doesn't make sense." Carol raised an eyebrow. "Are you really still trying to make sense of it?" Dr. Howell exhaled through his nose. "I suppose not. But medically speaking, this kind of improvement shouldn't be happening." Rachel glanced at Henry, who was scratching Buddy behind the ears with a fond look in his eyes. Maybe he just needed a reason to get better. And perhaps that was true. Perhaps Buddy's presence had given Henry something no medication or treatment could. A sense of belonging, a sense of comfort, a reason to hold on. Over the next few weeks, Henry's condition continued to improve. The hospital staff watched in awe as he regained strength. It wasn't miraculous, not exactly. He still tired easily. He still needed assistance with certain tasks. But he was awake, engaged, and smiling more than anyone had seen in months. One afternoon, as Rachel helped Henry adjust his pillows, he chuckled. "You all thought I wouldn't make it, didn't you?" Rachel smirked. "I think you surprised all of us." Henry patted Buddy's back. "Not him. He knew." Carol walked in just then, a stack of paperwork in her hands. "Henry, do you realize that you might actually be able to go home soon?" Henry's eyes widened slightly. "Home?" Carol nodded. "Your vitals are stable, your strength is improving, and Dr. Howell thinks, with the right in-home care, you could be discharged within a few weeks." Henry fell silent, looking down at Buddy. He ran his hand through the dog's fur, something thoughtful in his expression. "I never thought I'd go home again." "Well, it looks like you might," Carol said with a smile. As the days passed, the prospect of leaving the hospital became more real. Henry was moved to a different wing to begin physical therapy, working on regaining more mobility. And through it all, Buddy remained by his side. The thought that he might finally leave the hospital was both exciting and terrifying. Henry hadn't been home in so long. What would it be like? Could he manage on his own? One evening, as Rachel sat beside him, she asked, "Are you ready for it?" Henry took a deep breath. "I don't know, but I think it's time." The staff prepared for Henry's discharge. Arrangements were made, supplies were gathered, and plans were put in place to ensure he had everything he needed. And then came the question no one wanted to ask. "What about Buddy?" Greg asked one night as he and Carol finished reviewing Henry's final medical notes. Carol hesitated. "I don't know. He's not really ours to decide for." Rachel walked up, having overheard. "Buddy will do what he's always done. He'll go where he's meant to be." None of them had an answer for that. None of them knew what would happen when Henry finally left. But they had all come to trust that Buddy knew more than any of them did. The night before Henry was scheduled to be discharged, the hospital felt different. The usual hum of machines, the quiet murmurs of night shift nurses. It was all the same. And yet there was an unspoken awareness among the staff. In room 214, Henry lay awake. Buddy curled up beside him. He stroked the dog's fur absent-mindedly, staring up at the ceiling. "You've been with me this whole time," he murmured. "I don't know how you got here, and I don't know why. But I do know one thing. I couldn't have done this without you." Buddy didn't move, but his body was warm against Henry's side, steady and sure. Henry closed his eyes. "Whatever happens tomorrow, I hope you'll still be here." Buddy let out a soft huff, as if he understood. And in the silence of the night, with the steady sound of breathing filling the room, Henry drifted off to sleep. One last time in the hospital, but perhaps for the first time in a long time, feeling whole. The morning of Henry Jensen's discharge was met with a quiet buzz of anticipation throughout the hospital. The nurses who had grown accustomed to checking on him, the doctors who had monitored his slow but undeniable progress, even the janitorial staff who passed by his room every evening, everyone had come to feel a certain warmth when they thought of room 214. And now, Henry was leaving. Carol walked down the hall with a clipboard in hand, making sure every part of the transition had been accounted for. Henry's medical records had been transferred to his primary care physician, his prescriptions had been arranged for home delivery, and an in-home nurse was scheduled to visit him 3 times a week. Everything was in order. Everything except for one lingering question. Rachel leaned against the counter at the nurse's station, arms crossed as she stared at the paperwork. We're not really just letting him leave without knowing what happens to Buddy, right? Greg exhaled through his nose. I don't think we get to decide that. Maybe not, Rachel admitted. But what if Buddy just disappears? What if the moment Henry walks out of those doors, he's gone? Her voice was softer now, uncertain. I don't want that. Carol didn't have an answer. No one did. The past weeks had been spent watching the impossible unfold, and now they were on the verge of reaching a moment none of them had prepared for. What if Buddy really was only meant to be here, in the hospital? What if he wasn't supposed to go beyond these walls? Henry himself seemed calmer than any of them. He sat up in bed, hands folded in his lap, while Buddy lay curled at his side. The old man watched the staff shuffle in and out of his room, making last-minute checks and adjustments. Through it all, his fingers absently ran through the dog's thick fur. You all look worried, he remarked after a while, his voice holding a note of amusement. Rachel smiled. Maybe we are. It's not every day someone recovers faster than expected. And it's definitely not every day that a dog shows up in a locked hospital and refuses to leave your side. Henry chuckled. Life's full of surprises. Carol approached the bed, clipboard in hand. Are you ready, Henry? Your transport should be here soon. He nodded slowly. As ready as I'll ever be. A short time later, the transport team arrived. A wheelchair was rolled in, and Henry, with some assistance, eased himself into it. The hospital staff gathered subtly in the hallway, trying to act as if they were simply going about their business, but failing to mask their curiosity. They watched as Henry was wheeled toward the exit, Buddy walking calmly beside him. The automatic doors slid open, revealing the morning light outside. The crisp air rushed in, bringing with it the faint scent of leaves and distant city life. Henry took a slow breath, savoring it. Carol, Rachel, and Greg stood near the entrance, their gazes fixed not just on Henry, but on Buddy. This was the moment they had all been waiting for. Would he step outside? Or would this be where his journey ended? Henry, sensing the tension, looked down at Buddy. Well, old friend, what do you say? For a second, everything seemed to pause. Then Buddy took a step forward. And another. And another. The collective breath of the hospital staff seemed to release all at once. Buddy walked beside Henry's wheelchair, unfazed, unbothered, as if this was exactly where he was meant to be, as if he had always intended to go with Henry, no matter where that might be. Rachel let out a soft laugh, shaking her head. Of course! He was never going to stay behind? Greg folded his arms, smiling. I guess we got our answer. Carol felt a warmth spread through her chest as she watched the two of them disappear into the waiting transport vehicle. They hadn't lost Buddy after all. He wasn't meant for the hospital. He was meant for Henry. The vehicle drove off, leaving the hospital behind. The moment felt surreal, as if they had all just witnessed something far bigger than themselves. Rachel turned to Carol. Think we'll ever see them again? Carol thought for a moment before answering. I think they'll be just fine. And somehow, she knew it was true. Henry hadn't been home in nearly a year. The moment the transport vehicle turned onto the quiet street where his house sat, a lump formed in his throat. It wasn't just a house. It was a lifetime of memories, a place he had never expected to see again. The vehicle slowed to a stop, and the driver stepped out to help Henry. Buddy, ever patient, sat beside him, as if he understood the significance of the moment. As soon as the door was opened, Buddy hopped out first, sniffing the air before turning back toward Henry as if to say, "You're home." The nurse assigned to help with Henry's transition, a woman named Linda, smiled as she unbuckled his seatbelt. "Take your time, Mr. Jensen. No rush." Henry nodded, but hesitated before making any moves. He was about to cross a threshold he hadn't thought possible, but Buddy, sensing his hesitation, nudged his hand, a simple but reassuring gesture. That was all it took. With Linda's help, he maneuvered into his wheelchair and let out a slow breath. The house stood just as he had left it. The white paint on the porch was peeling a little more than before, and the lawn had grown wilder in his absence. But it was still home. As soon as they reached the front door, Buddy pawed at it impatiently, tail wagging. Linda chuckled. "Looks like someone's ready to go inside." Henry managed a small smile as he reached for the handle. The moment he pushed the door open, a wave of nostalgia washed over him. The scent of old wood and faint traces of pipe tobacco lingered in the air, the same way it always had. Sunlight streamed through the living room windows, casting golden patches onto the worn wooden floor. Buddy trotted in first, his nails clicking against the floor as he made a quick lap around the house. He poked his nose into the kitchen, then the hallway, and finally into the bedroom, as if making sure everything was just as it should be. Henry wheeled himself in slowly, taking it all in. Linda busied herself checking the oxygen supply, making sure everything was in order. "We'll have a homemade checking in regularly," she reminded him gently. "But if you need anything at all, you've got my number." Henry nodded, grateful. "I appreciate it." Buddy circled back to him and sat by his side, leaning into his leg with a quiet sigh. Henry reached down, running a hand through the thick fur on his head. "Guess it's just you and me now, huh, boy?" The dog let out a small huff, his tail thumping against the floor. The first few days home were an adjustment. The silence felt heavier than Henry remembered. The routine of hospital life, the beeping machines, the constant chatter of nurses, had been replaced by stillness. But Buddy never left his side. When Henry moved from room to room, Buddy was there. When he napped, Buddy rested beside him. At night, the dog curled up at the foot of his bed, breathing in quiet rhythm with him. One evening, as Henry sat in his old recliner with Buddy at his feet, he let his thoughts drift. He had been given time he hadn't expected. A second chance. And while he didn't know how much time he had left, he knew one thing for certain. He wouldn't waste it. It started with small things. Each morning, Henry made an effort to get dressed instead of staying in his robe. He ate meals at the table instead of in his chair. And when the sun was out, he sat on the porch with Buddy beside him, watching the world move on outside his little house. Neighbors who hadn't seen him in months stopped by to say hello. Mrs. Callahan from next door brought over a homemade casserole. Tom, the mailman, paused his route to chat about the town's latest happenings. People had assumed Henry wouldn't be coming home, but now that he had, they seemed eager to welcome him back. Buddy took to these visits like a natural. He greeted each visitor with a wagging tail, sitting politely by Henry's side as if keeping watch over him. One afternoon, as Henry sat outside enjoying the breeze, a car pulled into the driveway. He recognized the vehicle immediately. Carol and Rachel stepped out, smiling as they approached the porch. "Well, look at you," Carol said, placing a hand on her hip. "You're settling in just fine." Henry chuckled. "I'm trying." Rachel knelt down to scratch Buddy behind the ears. "And this guy? Adjusting well?" Henry nodded. "Like he's been here all along." Carol exhaled, glancing around. It's good to see you here, Henry. I mean that. I never thought I'd be back, he admitted. Figured my days were numbered. Rachel smiled softly. You've got more left in you than you think. Carol took a seat on the porch railing. The hospital hasn't been the same without you. It's quieter. Feels different. Henry smirked. Well, I suppose I did bring some excitement. That's one way to put it, Rachel teased. But really, everyone still talks about you. And Buddy. Henry looked down at the dog, who was watching the women with his usual quiet attentiveness. He's the real miracle. Carol tilted her head. You really believe that, don't you? Henry met her gaze. I don't think Buddy came back just for me. I think he came to remind me of something. Life isn't done until it's done. Carol and Rachel exchanged a glance, both knowing they had witnessed something extraordinary in room 214. But here, seeing Henry at home, with Buddy by his side, it felt even more remarkable. They stayed for a while, sharing stories and laughter. When it was time for them to leave, Rachel crouched down to give Buddy one last scratch. Take care of him, all right? Buddy wagged his tail, and Henry smiled. He already is. As the car disappeared down the road, Henry sat back in his chair, the golden light of the evening settling over everything. Buddy laid his head on Henry's foot, content. There was no rush, no sense of urgency, just the quiet promise of another day ahead. The days at home settled into a rhythm, slow and steady, just the way Henry liked it. The mornings were quiet, filled with the soft hum of the radio playing old songs, the scent of coffee drifting through the house, and Buddy's gentle snuffling as he wandered from room to room. Henry took comfort in the routine, in the simple act of waking up in his own bed and knowing Buddy was always there, waiting. Each morning, Henry pushed himself a little more. The wheelchair had been necessary at first, but he was determined not to rely on it forever. With every step he took around the house, Buddy stayed close, watching, steadying him when needed. It was as if the dog knew exactly what Henry needed before he even asked. Linda, his home nurse, took notice. You're making progress, Henry. More than most would in your condition. Henry smirked, resting a hand on Buddy's back. I've got a good trainer. She smiled at the dog. I don't doubt that one bit. It wasn't just the physical improvements. Something deeper had shifted within Henry. He had spent so much time in that hospital, convinced that his days were numbered, that all he had left were memories. But Buddy's presence had changed that. He wasn't just waiting for the end anymore. He was living again. The neighbors started to notice too. At first, they had been cautious, unsure of how to approach him after so much time away. But soon, the visits became more frequent. Mrs. Callahan continued bringing over home-cooked meals, always with an extra portion for Buddy. Tom the mailman lingered a little longer each afternoon, sharing news about the town. Even the kids from down the street, who once ran past his house without a second glance, started stopping by, drawn to Buddy's calm and gentle nature. One afternoon, as Henry sat on the porch with Buddy at his feet, a familiar car pulled into the driveway. Carol and Greg stepped out, their faces lighting up when they saw him. Look at you, Carol said as she walked up the steps. You look good, Henry chuckled. Flattery will get you everywhere. Greg leaned against the porch railing. We had to see for ourselves. The hospital still talks about you, you know. All good things, I hope, Carol smirked. Mostly. You did leave quite the impression. Henry glanced down at Buddy. I think he left a bigger one. Greg scratched behind Buddy's ears. Hard to argue with that. They talked for a while, catching up on the latest hospital gossip and town news. Henry found himself enjoying the conversation more than he expected. He had spent so long feeling like an observer in his own life, but now he was part of the world again. As the sun started to set, Carol and Greg prepared to leave. Carol hesitated for a moment, then turned back to Henry. "You know, we never did figure out how Buddy got into the hospital." Henry looked at the dog, who was watching them with quiet patience. "Maybe we weren't supposed to." Greg chuckled. "I think you're right." After they left, Henry sat in the fading light, his hand resting on Buddy's back. The thought lingered in his mind. Some things weren't meant to be explained. Some things just were. The next morning, Henry woke to the sound of Buddy whining softly at the door. He followed the dog's gaze to the window and saw the first signs of autumn creeping in. The leaves tinged with red and gold, the air crisp with the promise of change. He stretched, feeling stronger than he had in months. All right, I'm up." Buddy wagged his tail, waiting patiently as Henry got dressed. The walks had started small, just to the porch, then to the mailbox. Now he wanted to go further. He wanted to see more, to do more. With his cane in hand and Buddy by his side, Henry stepped outside, ready for whatever the day would bring. That day, Henry decided to take a slow walk down to the small park a few blocks away. It had been years since he'd last visited, and he wasn't sure if he could make it there without exhausting himself. But he wanted to try. Buddy stayed close, as if sensing the importance of the moment. The walk was slow, measured. The sound of leaves crunching beneath their steps filled the air. Henry greeted a few familiar faces along the way, neighbors he hadn't seen in what felt like forever. They stopped to chat, offering words of encouragement, commenting on how much better he looked. "I think Buddy's the reason," Henry told them with a smile. When they finally reached the park, Henry sat on a bench near the duck pond. The cool autumn breeze rustled through the trees, carrying the scent of damp earth and fallen leaves. Buddy sat beside him, watching a group of children tossing breadcrumbs to the ducks. Henry let out a slow breath. "I forgot how much I loved this place." The truth was, he had spent so much time in his own house, too tired, too resigned to venture out. But now the world outside seemed full of life again. Maybe it always had been, and he had just forgotten how to see it. Buddy nudged his hand, as if urging him to stay in the moment. Henry chuckled and patted the dog's head. "Yeah, I get it. No more thinking about the past. Just enjoying today." They stayed at the park longer than Henry expected. People came and went, stopping to say hello, some lingering to talk about Buddy. The dog had a way of drawing people in, making them feel at ease. Henry saw it in their faces, the way they smiled, the way their shoulders relaxed. As the afternoon light began to fade, Henry finally stood. "Come on, boy. Time to head back." The walk home was slower, but Henry didn't mind. He had made it further than he thought he would, and that was enough. That night, as he settled into bed, Buddy curled up beside him like always. Henry stared at the ceiling, feeling something he hadn't in a long time. Peace. Over the next week, the walks became a daily habit. Sometimes just to the end of the street, sometimes to the park. Each step felt like reclaiming something he had lost. With Buddy beside him, he felt like he was moving forward, not just surviving, but living. One evening, as he sat on the porch watching the sunset, Linda stopped by for a checkup. "You're doing better than I expected, Henry." Henry nodded. "Feels good." She glanced at Buddy, who was resting his head on Henry's foot. "I think he's got a lot to do with that." Henry smiled. No doubt about it. The days blended into one another in the best way possible. The past no longer felt so heavy. The future didn't seem so uncertain. And Buddy, faithful as ever, stayed by his side through it all. Some things, Henry realized, couldn't be explained. But they could be felt. And that was enough. Henry had never expected life to feel so full again. He had spent so long in that hospital, feeling like each day was another tick of a countdown he couldn't stop. But here he was, walking further, breathing deeper, appreciating the crisp autumn air like he never had before. Buddy, as always, was his constant companion. Whether they were sitting on the porch or making their way to the park, Buddy was always near. Henry had gotten into the habit of talking to him, even if he wasn't sure the dog understood. You know, Buddy, I never thought I'd be the kind of person who just talks to a dog all day, Henry mused one morning as they sat on the porch. But here we are. Buddy tilted his head, his brown eyes filled with quiet understanding. You get it, don't you? Henry chuckled. You probably know more about me than most people do. The dog let out a small huff of air, resting his head on Henry's knee. The small park had become their usual spot. Henry went a little further every day, resting on his usual bench by the duck pond, watching the world go by. One afternoon, a woman approached him while he was seated, her young daughter clutching her hand. Henry recognized her. She lived a few houses down the street, but had never spoken to him before. "Excuse me, Mr. Jensen?" she said politely. Henry raised a brow. "Yes?" she smiled. "I just wanted to say that it's really nice seeing you out and about. My husband and I remember when the ambulance took you away months ago. We honestly weren't sure you were coming back." Henry was momentarily caught off guard. He hadn't really thought about how others had seen his absence. "Well," he said finally, "I wasn't sure I was coming back either." The woman chuckled. "I'm glad you did. And my daughter," she gestured to the little girl, "wanted to pet Buddy, if that's all right." Henry looked down at Buddy, who had perked up at the attention. "What do you think, boy?" Buddy wagged his tail, and Henry nodded. "Go ahead." The little girl crouched down and stroked Buddy's fur gently. "He's really nice," she said. "That he is," Henry agreed. After they left, Henry sat in silence for a long moment, watching Buddy. "You really do make people feel better, don't you?" Buddy gave a quiet wag of his tail, as if to confirm it. As the days passed, Henry found himself feeling stronger. Not just physically, but emotionally. The loneliness that had seemed inevitable when he left the hospital had never arrived. Instead, people came into his life in small, unexpected ways. He had thought he would live out his days in solitude, but somehow, Buddy had ensured that wouldn't happen. Then came the day that changed everything. It started like any other. Henry and Buddy took their morning walk, stopped by the park, and made their way home. But as they walked past a quiet stretch of road, Buddy suddenly froze. Henry frowned. "What is it, boy?" Buddy's ears were perked, his body stiff. A moment later, Henry heard it, the faint sound of whining coming from the bushes near Bemtsai. Henry hesitated before carefully making his way over, parting the brush with his cane. His breath caught in his throat when he saw what was there. A small dog, no older than a few months, curled up in a tight ball. Its fur was matted, and its eyes were wide with fear. "Oh," Henry murmured. "Where did you come from?" Buddy let out a soft whine and stepped closer, his body relaxed but cautious. The puppy sniffed the air, looking between Henry and Buddy. Henry glanced around, looking for any sign of an owner, but the street was empty, and the houses were a good distance away. No collar, no tags, just a small, frightened creature left to fend for itself. Henry sighed. "Well, Buddy, looks like we have a situation." He slowly crouched down, reaching out his hand. The puppy flinched at first, but then hesitantly sniffed Henry's fingers. After a moment, it let out a soft, hesitant wag of its tail. "That's it," Henry murmured. "We're not so scary, are we?" Buddy moved closer, sniffing the puppy and then licking its head. The small dog relaxed slightly, shifting on its tiny paws. Henry knew what he had to do. "Come on, let's get you someplace warm." With some effort, he gently scooped up the puppy, cradling it carefully in his arms. He hadn't held something so small in years. The puppy shivered slightly, but didn't resist. Buddy trotted beside him as they made their way home. Once inside, Henry set the puppy on a warm blanket near the fireplace and brought over a small bowl of water. The puppy lapped at it eagerly. Linda arrived for Henry's checkup later that afternoon and immediately noticed the new addition. "Well, what do we have here?" "A little stray," Henry explained. "Found him out on the road." She crouched down, inspecting the puppy with a soft smile. "He looks exhausted. Probably hasn't had a decent meal in a while." Henry nodded. "I'll see if anyone's looking for him, but until then, I guess he's staying with us." Buddy gave a soft huff, sitting protectively next to the puppy. Linda grinned. "Looks like Buddy approves." Henry watched the two dogs, something warm settling in his chest. "Yeah, I think he does." Over the next few days, Henry put up notices around town and checked with the local shelters, but no one came forward to claim the puppy. He didn't know if someone had abandoned him or if he had simply gotten lost. But as the days passed, it became clear that the little dog had found his home. The puppy, now named Charlie, took to Buddy instantly, following him around the house, curling up beside him whenever he napped. Henry found himself laughing more than he had in years, watching the two dogs interact. Charlie had brought a new energy into the house, and Buddy, steady, wise Buddy, seemed content to guide him. One evening, as Henry sat by the fire, Buddy and Charlie curled up on either side of him. He realized something. He had spent so much time in the hospital believing that his life was winding down, that he was at the end of something. But he had been wrong. He wasn't at the end. He was at the beginning of something new. The new rhythm of life continued to surprise Henry. Each day was filled with small but meaningful moments. Charlie had brought a spark of joy into the house that Henry hadn't realized was missing. He watched the young pup learn from Buddy how to follow the house's unspoken rules, how to sit quietly by Henry's side, how to greet neighbors with the same gentle charm Buddy had mastered. One morning, Henry decided it was time to visit the park again. He called both dogs to his side, his cane steadying him as they began the familiar walk. The air was brisk, the trees shedding their golden leaves in a slow, graceful dance. Charlie trotted ahead, his puppy energy boundless, while Buddy stayed close, ever the calm and steady companion. When they reached the park, Henry settled onto his usual bench. He smiled at the sight of Charlie chasing a falling leaf, barking happily as it fluttered just out of reach. Buddy watched the pup with an expression that almost looked like amusement, then lay down at Henry's feet, content. A young man jogging by stopped when he saw Henry. "Mr. Jensen, right?" Henry looked up. "That's me." The man smiled. "I've seen you here a few times. It's nice to see you out and about." Henry nodded. "I try to get out every day now." The man glanced at the dogs. "You've got quite the pair there." Henry chuckled. "They're good company." As the man jogged off, Henry felt a warm sense of belonging. It wasn't just about being outside, it was about being part of the world again, making connections he hadn't expected. Charlie ran back to him, wagging his tail and dropping a leaf at his feet, as if it were a prized treasure. Henry leaned down to ruffle the pup's ears. "Good job, Charlie." The days began to blend into a kind of peaceful routine. Mornings started with coffee and quiet moments on the porch. Afternoons were spent at the park or working on small projects around the house. And evenings brought the warmth of the fire, the soothing presence of Buddy and Charlie, and a deep sense of gratitude that Henry carried with him into every new day. It was during one of those quiet evenings that Henry received an unexpected phone call. He didn't recognize the number, but something told him to answer. The voice on the other end was familiar, though it had been years since he'd last heard it. "Henry, it's Linda." "Linda?" Henry said, surprised. "My nurse from the hospital?" "That's right," she replied, her tone warm. "I just wanted to check in. I heard you were doing well, and thought I'd see how you're getting on." Henry smiled, glancing at the dogs curled up beside him. "I'm doing just fine. Buddy's still here, and we've got a new friend, Charlie." "Another dog?" Linda laughed. "Sounds like you've got a full house." "It's a good kind of full," Henry said. "I'm walking every day, getting stronger. It feels like I've got a new lease on life." "I'm so glad to hear that," Linda said. "You know, everyone at the hospital still talks about you and Buddy. You really left an impression." Henry felt a warm flush of gratitude. "That means a lot." After they said their goodbyes, Henry set the phone down and looked at Buddy and Charlie. "Guess we're famous, huh?" Buddy opened one eye and thumped his tail, while Charlie let out a happy bark. The days turned into weeks, and soon the season began to shift again. Winter's chill crept in, bringing frosty mornings and the occasional dusting of snow. Henry found himself spending more time indoors, but he didn't mind. The house felt alive, filled with the quiet companionship of his two dogs. One particularly cold morning, Henry awoke to find Buddy sitting by the front door, looking out the window. He seemed alert, almost as if he were waiting for something. Charlie, still sleepy, yawned and curled up by the fireplace. Henry walked over and looked out the window. The street was empty, the neighborhood quiet under a blanket of frost. "What is it, boy?" he asked, his voice low. Buddy didn't move, his eyes focused on something in the distance. Henry couldn't see what had caught the dog's attention, but he knew better than to ignore Buddy's instincts. "Well, let me know if you see anything interesting," Henry said, giving Buddy a pat before returning to his chair by the fire. As the morning stretched on, Buddy eventually relaxed and returned to Henry's side. Whatever had held his attention seemed to pass, and the day continued as usual. But Henry couldn't shake the feeling that Buddy had known something was different. In the weeks that followed, Henry began to notice subtle changes in Buddy. The once tireless dog seemed to rest more often, his movements a bit slower. It wasn't anything dramatic, but Henry knew Buddy well enough to sense the difference. "You're not getting younger, are you?" Henry murmured one evening as he scratched Buddy's ears. Buddy wagged his tail faintly, his eyes still warm and steady. Henry felt a pang of worry but pushed it aside. "You'll tell me if you need anything, won't you?" Buddy simply leaned into his hand, a silent assurance that for now, everything was okay. The bond between the two dogs grew stronger. Charlie, ever the playful pup, seemed to pick up on Buddy's cues. When Buddy rested, Charlie stayed close, as if watching over him. When Buddy did feel like moving around, Charlie followed eagerly, matching his pace. Henry watched the two of them and marveled at how life had unfolded. He had gone from lying in a hospital bed, convinced his best days were behind him, to this, his home filled with warmth, love, and the gentle presence of his two companions. It was on a snowy afternoon, as Henry sat by the fire with Buddy and Charlie curled up beside him, that he realized something important. He had thought his story was nearing its end. But now, it felt like it was just beginning. And that was more than enough. The quiet days of winter rolled into the first whispers of spring, with patches of grass reappearing under the melting snow. The air was still chilly, but it carried the faintest hint of warmth, as if the world was slowly waking up again. Henry noticed the changes outside and felt them mirrored in himself. He was still here, still breathing, still living. And he had Buddy and Charlie to thank for it. Each day had become a gift, a series of moments Henry hadn't thought he'd experience again. The way sunlight poured into the living room and lit up the fur of the two dogs as they napped. The sound of the wind shifting through the budding trees outside. The soft pads of Buddy and Charlie's feet on the wooden floor as they followed him from room to room. These little details had become the fabric of Henry's life, and he cherished every thread. Buddy remained Henry's steadfast shadow, though the old dog's pace had slowed. Charlie, as playful as ever, brought a youthful energy that balanced Buddy's quiet strength. Together, the dogs filled Henry's days with joy, grounding him in the present. One morning, Henry sat on the porch with a steaming mug of coffee. Buddy and Charlie lay at his feet, both watching the world go by. A few birds flitted from branch to branch, their songs rising into the clear sky. It was a scene so simple, yet it held a deep beauty that Henry never tired of. He looked down at Buddy, whose muzzle was grayer than it had been when they first reunited. Buddy met his gaze, his brown eyes calm, and full of something Henry could only describe as understanding. It was a look that seemed to say, "You're doing just fine." "You know, boy," Henry said, his voice quiet, "I think you saved me. I don't know how or why, but you did." Buddy's tail thumped once against the porch. Charlie perked up at the sound and let out a small bark before darting off into the yard to chase a fluttering leaf. Henry chuckled. "And you brought this little rascal into my life. Guess I owe you twice." The days continued, each one folding gently into the next. Henry felt stronger, more at peace. He still thought about the hospital sometimes, about the long weeks when he had been sure he wouldn't leave that bed. But those thoughts no longer weighed him down. Instead, they reminded him of how far he'd come, and how much he had to be grateful for. One afternoon, Henry decided to go further than the park. With his cane in hand, Buddy at his side, and Charlie bounding ahead, he walked to the edge of town. The air was crisp, the sun warm on his face. When he reached a small overlook that offered a view of the countryside beyond, Henry stopped and took it all in. The rolling hills, the scattered trees, the winding dirt road that stretched toward the horizon, it all seemed so vast, so alive. He sat on a bench overlooking the scene, Buddy lying down beside him, while Charlie sniffed curiously at a patch of wildflowers nearby. Henry closed his eyes for a moment and let the sounds of the world surround him. The rustling leaves, the chirping birds, the faint hum of a distant car. All of it was a symphony he never thought he'd hear again. You brought me back to this, Henry said softly, reaching down to rest a hand on Buddy's head. You showed me what I was missing. The old dog leaned into his touch, his warmth grounding Henry in that moment. Charlie returned, plopping down on the grass in front of them, his tail wagging as he looked up at Henry. And you, Henry said with a smile, you reminded me that it's never too late to start fresh. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, painting everything in shades of gold and orange, Henry felt a profound sense of contentment. He didn't know how many more days he would have, but he knew he would make the most of each one. Because Buddy had taught him that life wasn't just about how long it lasted. It was about the moments that made it meaningful. Buddy let out a soft sigh, and Henry leaned back, letting the peace of the moment settle over him. He had found his place, his purpose, his reason to keep going. And for that, he would always be grateful.